Getting extremely rich dividend growth investing actually isn't all that hard to do, and dividend growth investors have been doing it for years now. But in this video, we're going to be specifically going over the VOO ETF, and I'm going to be showing you how even with a relatively small amount of money invested into this premium dividend growth ETF, any everyday investor can get extremely rich if they just buy and hold for the long term. Now, whether you own VOO or consider yourself a dividend growth investor, make sure to drop a like down below, stick around, and let's get right into it. I just finished my brand new dividend investing ebook where I share exactly how I went from zero to now over 7 figures invested, and also on how I earned more than $6,000 per month in dividends. I also finished my custom dividend tracker that you can use to track your dividend income progress on an ongoing basis. So make sure to grab yourself a copy of my dividend investing ebook and the new dividend tracker today. It's the first link in my description. Now, we've talked about this before on the channel, but when it comes to dividend growth investing, especially when it comes to finding the right investment vehicle, there's a small list of different metrics that I normally go through and try to cross off and see if or not the investment vehicle crosses off everything that I'm looking for. And spoiler alert, the Vanguard S&P 500 ETF or VOO does cross off everything. VOO does have some positive price return long term, and we're going to go through all this deeper here in a second. VOO does also have a decent starting dividend yield, which is going to give dividend growth investors a nice amount of cash flow from day one, even with a relatively small amount of money invested. VOO also offers significant dividend growth, or at least has historically, which means that just buying into this asset, VOO is going to pay you more and more quarter after quarter, year over year. Also, VOO has a rock solid group of holdings, which comparing other ETFs to the Vanguard S&P 500 ETF is honestly hard just because VOO has some of the best holdings of all time. And maybe last but not least, what I look for is a cheap expense ratio, which VOO's expense ratio, as you can see right here, is 0.03%, which is just about as cheap of an expense ratio as you're going to find throughout the markets. So now that we're on the same page and we know that VOO crosses off everything, what I would consider as close to as perfect as possible for a dividend growth ETF, the VOO product summary says invest in stocks of the S&P 500 index, representing 500 of the largest US companies, which again is why it's very hard to compare VOO to any other dividend growth ETF out there. This is about the gold standard if there is one. Now, we talked about price return and that's an important metric when it comes to picking the right dividend growth ETF, and VOO is up 345% at the max time frame, and that's not even including dividends. So even if an investor with a relatively small amount of money invested into VOO, say 10 years ago, they would have over doubled their initial principal, not even including dividends. Now, we talked about VOO's holdings. It's obviously the S&P 500. It's basically 500 of the best companies in the US. So if you want to have a lot of exposure in things like technology, healthcare, financials, consumer cyclical, and exposure to things like Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Nvidia, Alphabet, Meta, Tesla, Berkshire, and JP Morgan, and like we said, 500 companies in all, a super diversified, high quality portfolio, which again is going to be very, very hard to beat. Now, because VOO for one is basically trading at all-time highs as of right now, and on top of that, just because the nature of this ETF, the starting dividend yield is going to be on the smaller end, considering the trailing 12-month dividend yield is around 1.38%, so VOO is not going to give investors a massive amount of cash flow from day one, and of course, that's not the point of VOO. VOO is obviously an ETF that does pay a dividend and does grow the dividend, which we're going to talk about here in a second, but most investors are buying into VOO to get rich also off the principal, because this ETF has continued to grow substantially over time. But a little bit more on dividend growth, which is one of my favorite metrics, and I find it very important as a long-term dividend investor, especially if you have a smaller portfolio. Dividend growth is going to stretch the portfolio a lot further, especially if you reinvest the dividends along the way. Now, as far as VOO's dividend growth, the trailing 12 months is 6.9%, not bad at all. 6.2% in the 3-year, the 5-year 6%, and the 10 years around 7.42%. So although there are ETFs out there that do have faster dividend growth, of course, and there's some that have slower, VOO's dividend growth has been substantial at an average of around 7%, which again definitely helps investors long time generate more dividends every quarter and every year, and then of course allows them to reinvest those dividends into more shares of VOO or whatever the case might be. Now, before we go through the exact math and I show you exactly how easy it is to get disgustingly rich by just investing a relatively small amount of money consistently into something as high quality as VOO, looking at VOO's performance over multiple time frames, and this is total return, so this is dividends and price return included. And again, there are some assets that outperform VOO, of course, over these time frames, but it's very hard to outperform VOO. It's very tough to outperform the S&P 500, and you're going to see here in a second. So just for starters, over the last year, VOO's up 23.4%, very impressive. The last 3 years, 33.65%, and the last 5 years, 99% over the last 5 years. So again, like we mentioned, there are going to be other assets out there, whether it's stock or ETFs, that might outperform VOO on specific time frames, but again, longer term, if you want to invest in something that's most likely going to outperform most other ETFs or stocks across the market and own an ETF for very, very cheap, VOO is definitely a great ETF to look into. Now, I promised you guys that with a relatively small amount of money invested into something as powerful as VOO, for example, any everyday investor could build a massive amount of wealth long term. So for this first example, let's say an investor invested a starting principal of $10,000 into the VOO ETF, which again, relatively speaking, is not all that much money. VOO has around a 1.4% initial annual dividend yield, around a 7%, 7.2% annual dividend amount increase, around a 5% annual share price appreciation depending on the time frame. And on top of that, let's say this investor also invested around $12K per year into VOO, reinvested the dividends on the way, and if this investor did this for just 30 years, let's see what would happen. So because VOO is only offering around a 1.4% dividend yield at the start, even the $10,000 invested is not really going to generate all that much dividend income for an investor. But again, with the dividends being reinvested in the annual contribution and just how much VOO grows consistently, you're going to see that by year number 7, basically the portfolio is already almost at $100,000. And by year number 15, the portfolio is at $283,000. By year number 20, considering if this is, say, a younger investor starting off, if they started investing at age 25, they could already have almost $500,000 worth of VOO by, say, 45 years old, earning around $10,000 per year in dividends. Now, all the way at the bottom, keep in mind this is just $10,000 starting and $12K per year. Every single year with dividends reinvested, the investor would have over $1 million worth of VOO and almost $28,000 per year in dividends. So there we have it, a deep dive into VOO, the Vanguard S&P 500 ETF, which in my opinion is one of the highest quality dividend growth ETFs across the entire stock market. Now, obviously, when it comes to any high quality investment like VOO, the idea is to get invested into it as quickly as possible with as much money as possible and let the power of compounding do its thing. But when it comes to building wealth long term and picking the right ETF when it comes to retirement, what is your number one buy and hold forever ETF that you're looking to build out a position in when it comes to building massive wealth for retirement? Drop the ticker symbol in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to please drop a like and subscribe for more future content like this. Thanks as always for stopping by, and if you are interested in investing, make sure to check out these recent videos I posted right here.